This is lecture number 25. When the Civil War ended, everybody involved needed to figure out how they were going to put the country back together. The North had gone to fight this war to determine the permanency of the Union. Once they had the Union back together, they really had to figure out how to make that last. How were they going to keep it together? One of the stories that has come to us in the 21st century is that Reconstruction was a failure, that the Northerners tried to make a new South and it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. What this lecture and the following lecture will argue is that the reason Reconstruction didn't work out was because white supremacists gained control of the Southern government and eventually the Union government as a whole. This lecture in particular talks about the successes of early Reconstruction, particularly in getting African Americans involved directly in government. Think about the end of the war. In April of 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, which is in Maryland. That officially ended the war. That was the major Confederate Army and the major Union Army. But there were what you might call mopping up operations that continued all the way into June of 1865. So again, the history books very neatly say the war ended in April of 1865. But that did not mean that all the Confederates surrendered and that was the end of the war, happy days. The Confederates continued to try to fight anywhere that they were not actively suppressed by the Union. So the Union armies had to continue capturing Confederate territory, suppressing Confederate armies, and as I said, that took all the way into June of 1865. The last military actions of the war finally took place in Texas in June of 1865. The Union had suppressed the Confederacy in the East, but then they had to move west, and the Confederates basically just kept moving ahead of them toward the west. On June 19th of 1865 in Texas, this General Order Number 3 was issued. And the effect of this general order was to finally free enslaved people in Texas. Now, wait a minute, you're saying. Didn't the Emancipation Proclamation do that? Didn't the passage of the 13th Amendment do that? No, because of the way the Confederacy was organized, because of the insistence of enslavers to hold on to their enslaved people, enslavers in Texas had simply kept their enslaved people in bondage even after the law said they were supposed to be freed. So it was this military order that announced to the enslaved people of Texas that they were officially free. But I want you to notice something about this order. It declares the enslaved people are free. It gives an absolute equality between masters and enslaved people, but then the freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. What this military order was saying was the enslaved people are free, but they should still continue to work for the same people in the same conditions. It makes the assumption that the natural tendency of African Americans is to not work. So on the one hand, this is really super cool. This is the genesis of the holiday Juneteenth that we celebrate today to celebrate the end of legal slavery in the United States. But even within this order that created Juneteenth is this embedded racism of expecting that African Americans will continue to labor at the same positions no matter what. What followed the end of the Civil War and Juneteenth was a time period called presidential Reconstruction, which you have read about in your textbooks, so I won't tell you a ton about it. Presidential Reconstruction extends through 1865 and well into 1866. The president in question is President Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson had been a political pick for vice president because he was a Southerner, because he was basically a Democrat that was willing to run on the same ticket with Lincoln. He was seen as a way to get hesitant Northern Democrats on board with voting for Lincoln for a second term. Of course, they never expected that Lincoln would die and turn the presidency over to Johnson. When Johnson became president, his real sympathy for the South came out, and he was very, very lenient on them. He allowed white Southerners to return to the vote, to return to office, to reorder their governments in whatever way they saw fit, and essentially not to be punished for their treason against the United States at all. He did not support any protections for the freedmen. While they were told they were free, they were not given the right to vote. They were not given equal protection under the laws. They were not given the right to hold property. They were essentially stateless people. They were people who were not citizens, who lived in the United States but did not have rights. Following Johnson's presidential Reconstruction came the period that we call Congressional Reconstruction. The radical Republicans who were in control of Congress detested Andrew Johnson and were determined to not allow him to return the South to its previous state. They were determined to provide actual rights, meaningful citizenship to the freed people of the South. They attempted to pass law after law after law to protect the freedmen. Most of these Johnson vetoed. In 1866, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act to protect the civil rights of freed African Americans. Johnson vetoed that. Congress was then able to override the veto. When they overrode that veto, they realized the extent of the power that they had, that they didn't have to wait around while Johnson vetoed stuff. They could simply pass the laws that they felt were necessary. When they then did very well in the election of 1866, it ushered in this period of congressional reconstruction when the Republicans had such a strong majority in the Congress that they could override any veto that Johnson put forward, and they were really able to push Johnson aside in terms of decision-making regarding Reconstruction. In this period of congressional Reconstruction, they prioritized passing laws that gave rights to freedmen. They passed explicit racial equality legislation, and most famously, they passed the 14th Amendment that clearly says all people have access to the same rights. Everybody is equal before the law.
This is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the first section. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Any person within its jurisdiction cannot be denied the equal protection of its laws. To me, the 14th Amendment, especially this idea of equal protection under the law, is the whole enchilada for me. First of all, when you talk about protection, that implies that there must be a harm someplace that you're trying to protect someone from. That opens the door to have a whole discussion about reality. A lot of this stuff floats above reality. It's all abstract principle. But to have equal protection under the law means that you're going to have some permission for some activism from the government. You're going to have some permission to talk about inequality, unequal treatment, unfair treatment for they were contemplating African Americans, but they say everybody. So it doesn't say equal protection under the law unless you're a lesbian. It's not what it says. It doesn't say equal protection under the law unless you're African American. It's not what it says. It says if you're in the jurisdiction, you get equal protection under the law. That's radical. 10,000 years of human history, that's radical. Equal protection under the law.
It's hard to believe that before 1866 that was not a part of our Constitution. The Republicans were also extremely angry at the Southern states. They blamed the Southern states for the war. They blamed the Southern states for their horrible racism, for the torture that they had enacted on African Americans for centuries. And so in Congressional Reconstruction, they actively punished the Southern states. They excluded them from Congress. Congress determines their own makeup, and they can say, no, you're not a state. You're not allowed to be in Congress. And that's what they did with the old Southern states. They rejected them from Congress. They sent in military occupation instead. So the regions that used to be Virginia, Georgia, Texas, those states were wiped out and replaced with military districts that were run by a military government. And it was only over time that the states were able to reorganize themselves and re-petition for admission as states. They had to start the whole statehood process over again.